So basically, I live on a farm with my partner, John, who's born and bred Cumbrian. And we live near Coniston Water. And he's a sort of traditional family farmer. His family have farmed within 3 miles of where we farm now for 600 years, probably longer, but 600 years is when they started recording the families in the area. And I come from a very different background. I come from an art background. So farming was very new to me, but I think it was interesting to join John because I could see things with fresh eyes. And coming from an art background, when you decide to do a project, you just research and do it. So it didn't really matter that I didn't know anything about farming. I just sort of got stuck in, really. So it's a small family farm. The actual farm's only 45 acres, and then John rents a lot of land from the National Trust, grazing for the National Trust, the National for Natural England, lots of sort of private landowners as well that want their land grazed in specific ways, and for a conservation charity as well. So he's very sort of involved in that, and both become more interested in moving away from a kind of making a farm quite slick in its operation and going back to a traditional family farm, which is very diverse and complex and just has a little bit of everything rather than just doing like textile sheep. We have lots of different breeds of sheep. We've got mainly Cheviots, which are a good, strong, hardy sheep. John used to have Herdwicks, but he lost them all in foot and mouth, and you couldn't buy them again. There was very little stock, so he just got into Cheviot sheep. So we have them, Castlemilk Murits, Teeswaters, Hebrideans. So this is Hebridean that I'm wearing, mixed with Blueface Leicester. So we have lots of different breeds of sheep on the farm, and that's because we're interested in doing things with the wool. We sell a lot of our meat to our local butcher, and so the different breeds are ready at different times. If you just have one breed of sheep and you lamb them at the same time, all the lambs are fat and ready to go to auction all at exactly the same time. But if you have a more primitive breed, it's slower growing, it means that that lamb is ready for the butcher at a different rate. So it means that we can supply lamb and hogget kind of year round to our local butcher, which is great. So when I joined John on the farm, although I loved the farming side, I wasn't that useful to him. And so I felt that I didn't really want to go and get another job off site because I liked being on site and I wanted to be my own boss after years of working for other people. So I just started to see how we could make more of what we have on the farm, and also knowing that subsidies would soon go for farmers and to not be reliant on farm subsidies. So I was looking at ways to increase profitability on the farm without increasing the number of animals and just becoming a bigger farm. I looked at how we could make the most of what was already there. And so that was selling our meat direct or selling it to the butcher, because then you're kind of got more of a guaranteed price rather than taking it to auction. And sometimes you get a good price, but it's like Russian roulette. You never know. Some weeks it's really bad. And also we have some off-grid accommodation that I rent from the National Trust. So that's a good income in the Lake District because there's always visitors that want to stay somewhere unusual. And I have one Jersey cow, so I started making soap using excess milk from her. And that's turned into a nice little business in itself. And starting with wool, I didn't know anything about wool to begin with. So everything I started doing on the farm, I did very small at the beginning. So when I started the soap business, I probably invested about £50 on ingredients and equipment and built up from there. So taking small risks, tried making cheese, but that was a bit of a disaster. So then I tried with soap and that worked. And then I was able to grow the business. I did the same with wool. And I think the first batch of wool I got done, I got 20 kilos done. And that was probably about 6 years ago. And then this last time that I sent wool off, it was 2 tons. So I started very small, probably spending about £500, and I thought, if it's a disaster, I've lost £500, but that's like a holiday or something like that. So I always try and work it out that if it's a loss, it's not going to destroy our business, because especially on a family farm like John's family, who've had it forever, you're always looking at the past and the future. So every decision that you make, you're thinking about, you don't want to mess it up because you've got all that history behind you, and also leaving the farm in a better state for the next generations to come. So we always are quite cautious, actually. And naturally, I wouldn't be, but with John, I am more cautious with how I spend, and it's actually been very beneficial. It's meant that I've not made so many costly mistakes in what I've done. I learned a lot by just going to wool events like Wool Fest and meeting people like Kate and Zoe, who are very open and very into knowledge sharing, which is fantastic because not everyone in business is. That was really brilliant. And then I met the farmer and writer James Rebanks, and I said to him he should do something with his wool because I just thought it was crazy that all farmers get very little for the wool, but him in particular, I think surely his audience who love his book will want to buy his wool. So he said, you do something with it and just pay me when you've made some money. So that was a bit of a nightmare, like thinking, I don't know what to do with this. But anyway, I ended up making some products with it. Here is some of his tweed. I'll show you close up. You can see that's a lovely Herdwick tweed. It's just made into a little project bag, but I make shepherd's bags with it, which is the main thing that I make with his wool. And that's done in very sort of small scale, very completely traceable. I know sort of every part of that wool journey. But that got me thinking about what you can do with some of these breeds that you might not want to have as knitting wool. Every sheep breed in the UK can all go into a fabric, that you don't necessarily have to wear next to your skin, or it's lined so it doesn't really matter if it's a bit scratchy. So that led me to a new project which I just got some funding for from Farming and Protected Landscapes, FIPL, which is a DEFRA fund to support farmers as they move away from subsidies. And so that's brilliant to have that support, because actually 2 tons of wool that I've had processed, that's probably going to turn that into tweed will probably cost about £40,000. And that's partly why when you think, oh, wool's worth nothing, how come a wool jacket is so expensive? The processing is just expensive. It always has been expensive. It's not that it's more expensive now because the industry is a lot smaller. It's just that cheap plastic clothing is cheap for a reason. But wool has always been expensive, and you just wouldn't buy that many clothes. You just have 1 or 2 wool dresses and a couple of wool jackets. You just wouldn't have a new jacket every year from the high street. And I also did a Kickstarter campaign. So people have pledged and bought some of the fabric already without even seeing it. And so that project, this new tweed project, is Lake District tweed. Eventually, over 3 years, I'll be making 13 valley tweeds. So each valley will have its own specific tweed with wool from that valley, and the design will be based on special things about that valley. So in Coniston, it's the design is based on the copper mines and the Coniston slate. And Ullswater is based on James Rebanks' work that he does in regenerative farming. So that's based on a wildflower meadow, which is lovely. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. And as Zoe said, I'm working with her. We were the flock. That business will be evolving into something else because, sometimes business doesn't go exactly how you want. And we've had to disband that business because it was 3 of us and it's now just me and Zoe. So we're thinking of a new name at the moment. But it's all still going ahead and very exciting. But, these journeys are not always straightforward and they can be a big complex headache. But it's an incredibly exciting time to be involved with wool. The wool board is changing. They're really, really supportive of small businesses like ours, like Kate's, and they want to support our sort of scale of business at the moment. How they've been working is such a vast scale. It's been very difficult to access wool for brands and small producers like ourselves. I think the minimum was something like 8 tons, and you bought it in auction and you're bidding against people that might not want you to be in the arena bidding against them because they kind of like the system as it was. So they're trying to find new ways of working with people like ourselves so that we can buy wool without having to go through auction and can buy wool with provenance, so that's not lost. When it goes in from a farm, it gets graded into a certain type, and so a lot of that information then is lost. And they're realizing through having conversations with people like us, that's actually the really important thing, and they're losing value. It's devalued at that point when no longer traceable. So they've been incredibly supportive, and it's great to see actually, and it makes what we're doing, having that support from a big organisation, is really brilliant.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here with you all tonight. So yeah, I run Northern Yarn, which is a wool shop in Lancaster with a really strong focus on British wool and local wools where I can find them. So I started my business 6 years ago when me and my family moved back to the Northwest after a long time in London. And the idea to start the business came from a lifelong love of knitting and a series of fortunate events, really. This is my shop in Lancaster, and I'm proud to say that all of those sweaters there are made from local yarn, local farms, knitted by me. But I'm really proud that I can stock local wool in the shop and work with local farmers. I adjusted really quickly to life in Lancaster when we moved up. I was just struck immediately, of course, moving from the big smoke to Lancaster, the amount of green, lush countryside there was around and the amount of sheep that we could see. You know, my daughters go to a school out in the countryside and we passed all these farms every day. And yet when I tried to find sort of local yarns, British yarns at the local wool shop, I couldn't find any. What I could find had been maybe British yarn, but spun abroad. So that kind of started a few triggers in my head about what I wanted to be knitting with and why I couldn't find it. So my youngest was just started to go to nursery. So I was ready to go back to work. And the final big bang was that our local wool shop closed. So it kind of gave me the push to start Northern Yarn and think about how I wanted it to run as a business. And that was alongside our local community, using the seemingly plentiful resource that was around us everywhere. And I wanted to go and talk to these farmers who, you know, had these sheep that had fleeces that I coveted. I did lots of research into British wool and I found West Yorkshire spinners who produce some excellent yarns, all with British wool. But I was really happy to find Lancashire farm wool. So Kate Schofield, who lives in Cheshire, and she works with farms around Silverdale and produces, and Troffer Bowland, and produces a lovely range of just natural, undyed, breed-specific yarns. So together with a few other bits and pieces, I literally took the wool to market, Garstang and Lancaster. I think this was my first market store, and it was really hard work. We'd set up in all weathers, rain, snow, but it was a lot of fun. And I quickly realised that lots of other people were already British wool advocates and wanted to know where they could buy breed-specific and traceable yarns. So what I thought quite quickly was one way to learn about British wool was like a grassroots approach and learn on the job and have my own yarn produced from local farms. That's what I did. And I spoke, this is Lucy, who lives in Garstang. She found me on the market and she brought with her a lock of fleece from her Lovely's Warbles there and asked if I'd be interested in doing anything with it. And it was beautiful that the sort of tips were caramelized and bleached by the sun, and she only had a small flock. And as I did more research, that was to be a bit of a hurdle when it came to having wool produced from single farms. But I did have some Warbles, Pure's Warbles spun, and it now goes into a bigger blend of our Meatherer yarn to make a natural grey. This is John and Maria, who's here tonight. And it was through talking to farmers and learning more about the work that they did that really inspired me to have my yarn produced and support them by paying more for the fleeces than the British wool give at the moment. And with British wool being, you know, there's so many valuable properties, as we all know, warm, renewable, sustainable. And I was learning so much, especially from people like Maria and John, about their rare breeds and how they use their animals on the farm for the conservation grazing. It was a real education and still is. Much more close to me was a farm in Quormer. These are pedigree Poll Dorset lambs. And I met Lynn, who looks after them, at the school gates, and just asked her really what breed she kept, and did she know what happened to the wool when the sheep got sheared? Where did it go? And she said that, you know, she didn't have much to do with it once it was off their backs, and but that often the cost of shearing and transport for the fleeces to the wool board would be more than the actual return on the fleeces. So she asked me if I'd like to come and see them being sheared. And Lynn has been really helpful in the whole process and helped me pick fleeces and cleared a space for me in the barns. And it's been really lovely working with Lynn. There are quite a few really good fibre resource books, and of course Zoe, who is the font of all knowledge with breeds and fleeces. But at that time I consulted a big fibre book and looked up Pole Dorset and found out the properties and what I might expect when I had it spun. And it's a crisp yarn, it's not the softest yarn, but these are all shearling fleeces here, and just beautiful, really lovely, strong, with a nice crimp. And I was excited to have. I learned things like a break in the staple. So when you can kind of bounce it and pull it. And if the sheep has been ill or had a traumatic childbirth, there can be a break in the staple length. And it was funny, I related it to, I had quite a traumatic experience when I gave birth to, and I had dints in my toenails that kind of grew out in the same kind of way that I guess the sheep's fleece staple breaks. I found that quite interesting. We're all animals. The first thing was ringing around nearly all the mills in the UK, and there aren't that many actually, but they've all got different requirements. They've all got different minimum quantities. Some of them will only take quantities of fleece that's been scoured already. And if you want to go to the scourers, that they're so big and deal with so much fleece that you need hundreds and hundreds of kilos to go in. So of course, with this small amount, I had to look elsewhere. And I found Paul Crooks of Halifax Spinning Mill, and it was really knowledgeable. It's been spinning since he was, I don't know, 12, something crazy. He knows so much. And he was really, really helpful and invited me to the mill and agreed to spin. I think I had 2 lots. So I had some lamb's wool, 30 kilos of lamb's wool and 30 kilos of the Pole Dorset shearling in the Blueface Leicester. And there it is. So when it arrived back, I was really nervous at the time. Like I'd only been, the business had only been going a couple of months when I decided to jump in and just, see if I could have yarn produced. So I didn't know what it'd be like, but I was really, really pleased. The lamb's wool actually turned out to be really good sock wool, quite strong. And I think the Dorset yarns have a natural washing property, so they're almost machine washable. They don't felt, which was really cool. It was 100% traceable. These photos were taken on Clougher Fell, which is, you'll probably all know, it's a fell just outside of Lancaster, and it's looking over the fields to where the sheep live. We named it Jennet, our 4-ply, after a Lancastrian legend of the 16th century. Jennet, a few people had told me this story, and Jennet had ridden on horseback to London to rescue her orphaned grandchildren. And she rode alone with the grandchildren in her panniers all the way back to Lancaster. And so we thought we should honour her. And I don't know what she'd think about it, but we named this wool after her, Jennet. And there she is on the heather. This is me in the Pole Dorset and Blueface Leicester sweater. So it's really warm, really full yarn it produced, and we had a designer make a wrap. This was the Fleetwood wrap that was a nod to the old fishing town of Fleetwood. And there's just another selection. We went on to have more breed specific yarns produced from single farms. So we had some Kerry Hill, I think we had Lonk, which was great because it was a native Lancastrian sheep that would go on the Ribble Valley. They were a hill breed. There's warbles. We have mule produced, and this one's at the scouring plant in Bradford. And after we'd done lots of single farm yarns, we really wanted to have a yarn that could be a consistent line and that we could maybe have some colours dyed. And because you need big minimum quantities for colours, I needed to think a bit more broader, and so we decided to go to several farms, or 4 farms actually, and blend those breeds to get our quantity. So they actually halted production here. Again, really helpful and kind, and kind of a bit amused, I think. They let us come and put our little 250 kilos on, they stopped everything and let us watch it being scoured, which is here. So it went in and out the water all the way along the warehouse, and then it goes, after it's been washed, into a big kind of dryer, and you can completely see why they need the quantities, because any smaller amount would just get lost in the machines. This is at the carders, so we couldn't stay and watch it being carded, but they did allow us to see the whole scouring, and we took it off to the carders then and left it here. But this is some of the yarn that was being carded there into the Noils, I think it's called. This is just a picture of some of the yarns we've got at the shop. So this was a combination of 4 breeds. Cheviot, which initially Maria, I'd thought, because Maria and John keep Cheviot, and had it produced as a yarn, so I knew it was a really lovely strong yarn as a base. So we've got the majority of this yarn is Cheviot with Blueface Leicester, Shetland, and just 5% as warbles, which makes that natural grey. Here, these are all knitted with the Methra. I just found being able to make clothes from fully traceable yarns grown and spun in the Northwest, it's just something that makes me really happy, and it really connects me to the yarn that I use, to what I'm doing, and the people and the landscape. It all just ties in really nicely and feels good to be knitting with traceable yarns. I want to continue to work with farmers and produce local wool. But that's it, really. I hope you've enjoyed listening to a bit about why I started and why I enjoy what I do so much. I'm learning all the time, but I've just found everyone along the journey has been really helpful and knowledgeable, and just we'll share knowledge if you ask, and it's all there from people like Zoe and Maria. It's been a great journey, and I hope to continue doing it sometime.
So my name's Zoe. I was lucky enough to do a fully funded PhD under the AHRC, so a arts, craft, fashion and textiles based programme. So I come at this from a textile design and knitwear designer background, but I was really interested in kind of looking into where my materials came from. I'm going to focus on the PhD research, but I just kind of think it's interesting for you to kind of see that this is quite a scientific based project, but it is about kind of the aesthetics and the needs and the characteristics of wool, and how to kind of adapt that into real life situations that designers can use and can adapt to their own needs as well. So my kind of purpose for this, and the kind of question I set myself, was that I wanted to kind of create a British sheep breeds database that made accessible practical knowledge, and that there's so much, like Kate said, kind of once you get talking to people from farmers to production managers to scientists to knitters to crafters to crocheters, they all have a different vocabulary of how to describe the characteristics and that tacit knowledge that they know through making. So understanding and compiling some sort of database in order to kind of assess not just the breed characteristics for commercial data that's needed by designers and makers like Kate for creating beautiful yarns, but also the narrative behind it, so those breed histories and the associated provenance, and for aiding, like I said before, kind of designers and craftspeople, hopefully in this upward spiral of bringing British wool back to the forefront of luxury material, thoughtful, conscious consumption. So kind of not into fast fashion, not kind of overconsumption, but bringing it into where materials are appreciated and everyone within that chain is appreciated. So kind of my overarching aim was to design a physical and digital toolkit for designers to understand different qualities of purebred British wool for knitwear. So I wanted to experiment with new knitwear technologies to push the boundaries of conventional use, understand why production wasn't as prevalent within the UK, what we could do to bring things back to the UK, how British sheep breed characteristics had formed this production chain and this successful kind of chain that we did have, and how we could bring it back, but also how designers could be empowered to use more British wool within their designs, within their yarn collections. If it's not there for them to test out, then how are they ever going to find out that British wool is way more than an itchy scratchy material that everyone seems to jump to, but also, as I said before, link that heritage of wool with contemporary practice to add value to, unfortunately, an underutilized fibre at the moment. Wool has some amazing overarching characteristics that even though synthetics kind of wool is only 1% of global textile production now. However, synthetics have never been successfully able to replicate all the qualities of wool. So it controls temperature, wicks moisture away, dirt resistant, biodegradable, hypoallergenic, all these amazing qualities inbuilt naturally in a naturally renewable resource. And within that, it's not just 100% wool. 100% wool is fantastic, but once you start to see how many different varieties we have, so kind of written down on paper, the British Wool Board state there's over 60. I analysed 72 different breeds that are now predominantly classed as purebred British sheep. And once you go into kind of crossbreeds and mules, there's hundreds of different ones within it. And they all hold very different characteristics. So a Herdwick on the hills and a Herdwick turned into yarn comes out very differently to a blue-faced Leicester sheep on the hills and a blue-faced Leicester yarn to knit with. So I utilise British Wool's data for characterisation and classification. So they classify them into 7 different breed categories: fine, medium, cross, luster, hill, mountain, and naturally coloured. And I didn't look into the cross ones because although they classify 5 as them, actually there's hundreds of crossbreeds in all different determinations and percentages. So for this, I just focused on the pure breed to gather those foundations. And currently, kind of a very, very simplified version of the system that British Wool goes through is that farmers, if you have more than 4 sheep, should be registered with the British Wool Marketing Board, and fleece is then sent to a local collection site. You do have to pay for them to collect it. It then gets sent to the national facility where it's sorted and graded. And it's currently graded into, at the time when I did the research in 2014, it was 120 different grades. However, they're added and taken away all the time. And this is where that kind of homogeny between breed specifics starts to differ. So you could have grade 362 and that actually contains blue-faced Leicester type fleece. So it might not actually be 100% blue-faced Leicester, but the characteristics are very similar to a blue-faced Leicester fleece. So that kind of traceability and the provenance that we are able to have on that scale because of the way that the stratified sheep system and farming system is in the UK was actually starting to be lost within that. However, it's then baled and graded and then sent out for auction at monthly auctions throughout the year. So from a design perspective, it was great to kind of understand what was happening with wool right now, but from a designer's needs, what qualities did we need to know about and what did I need to focus upon in order to gather the best kind of information out of it that was useful for designers at different stages of utilising British wool. So the luster really helps with how a yarn takes dye, the sheen of it, how it knits up, the stitch definition, the crimp, so that kind of elasticity within it, whether it can be woolen or worsted spun, depends on the staple length and the different processes it has to go through. And then that base colour, like Kate touched upon, sometimes for the kind of carpet manufacture, which is unfortunately kind of where 80% of our fleeces go into, they want a kind of cream white base, because any of those grey or black guard hairs or fleeces make it a much tougher job to dye to the latest trends. Whereas actually when you talk to crafters and knitters and makers, some of the natural colours that you can get are actually some of the most interesting ones to work with, and you don't need to dye them. Or you can have a really nice grey base, a grey fleck base like Kate has, to really differentiate and start to bring in some interest on the dye process. So I wanted to make it visually appealing so people kind of come in at different levels. You didn't have to be a sheep expert or a wool expert. You just needed to be interested in where your materials came from and what kind of qualities you wanted within your final products, whether you were knitting it, crafting with it, knitting it commercially, crocheting it, felting it, whatever you wanted to do. So as I said before, I kind of categorized them into fine, medium, hill, mountain, luster and coloured, but then looked into the commercial data that was available for them and what you need to understand how fine you can spin it, what the handle's going to look like, the staple length, as I said before, whether it goes through a woolen or worsted spinning process, the colour, the kind of dyes, the actual weight or average weight of fleece that you get off a sheep. Because if you are a designer and you want to make 10,000 jumpers from rare breed Borere, you're not going to have enough, there's not enough fleece in the land to allow you to do that. However, if you wanted 10,000 jumpers made from Cheviot, that might be a little bit more accessible. When I kind of started the research, this is the data that I was gifted with. If you don't know what the colour YZ or colour D65 or VM base means, it's very hard to start to kind of differentiate what those characteristics could mean for an end yarn or an end kind of processed product. So what I wanted to do was make it more approachable. And obviously some of these characteristics, some of this data is really important to know. However, making it more attainable, making it more accessible, and putting it into kind of a context and a narrative that allowed a lot more people access to it. And also allowing people to talk through kind of their own narrative as well. So I kind of touched upon before, working with different knitters, different designers, going to different sheep shows, workshops, getting people to kind of touch and feel the yarn and really start to kind of interact with it, to gather a little bit of, almost create a library of words of how people describe these different handles. So some people would absolutely kind of touch the Herdwick fleece and automatically kind of recoil away, and they hated it because it had all those kind of guard heads in. However, some people felt that it was rustic and it kind of gave this kind of earthy realness to wool, and they wanted that. So understanding that narrative was really important to me as well. We can't compete with new manufacturing sites like China, India, Pakistan on price, but what we can do is incorporate all this amazing heritage and narrative that we have within the sheep industry and within farming, with the kind of access we have to new technologies for kind of sustainable sampling and new sampling technology, with the kind of quality of knowing exactly what we can put in our yarns and the blends and the breeds, and connecting up within kind of new networks of people that are really passionate about the same objectives as me and as others, to create this kind of upward spiral, as I said before, for a desirable material. So underneath that, in kind of an academic context, was the fact that it was all design based, but within that I needed to understand about the industry and marketing, how technology factored into it, sustainability and my own sustainable principles, as well as kind of what was available and what was out there in the wider context, craft and the handmade and how that factored in, as well as kind of the overarching theme of what those breed characteristics were, how they differentiated from each other, and how we could start to add value through all those different stories. So again, I kind of mentioned it was about connecting. So I had the most amazing conversations with some of the most knowledgeable and lovely people, connecting kind of farmers and talking to dyers and what kind of characteristics they liked, what the kind of challenges and advantages were to using different things, what makers needed out of it, what buyers wanted, what customers and designers. And so all these different conversations to understand what was really needed from a database and how to bridge those gaps. And again, important to me and important to kind of create this accessibility was how to document it, how to display it, and how to experiment with it. So kind of looking at it right from kind of those micro qualities of using SEM imaging to look into each breed sample. So I collected a fleece sample, whatever I could get commercially that had already been commercially spun into yarn, a yarn sample. If I couldn't find it already spun, I got it spun up in either hand spun or woolen spun. But looking at it right from kind of that scale structure and seeing those differences, even just aligned, 7 of them next to each other, and seeing how that different scale structure affects the felting qualities, the way it takes dye, the way that kind of the yarn gets can get structured within the combing process, is all related to those initial scale structures. And also they look really nice, and it's something that you don't get to see very often. And then taking that right through to kind of really advanced technology that was available. So the Shimaseki SDS1 Apex 3, which is a bit of a mouthful, allows you to kind of digitize those yarns. So from the microscopic qualities through to being able to scan them in, not waste any of those precious yarns, but create a digital reconstruction of them to understand whether they would go through different gauge machines, how they would act knitted up. But you didn't want to waste any resources through putting them through the machines, and kind of creating that variety to still seeing how different the British Ruse looked against the Castle Moret, and creating this library just as a visual to kind of show the differences between breeds. You've got kind of Hebridean next to Herdwick, next to Jacob, and Lincoln Longwool. You can really start to see the variety there, and all 72 are different. And mapping those against kind of colour technologies as well, and seeing how kind of naturally coloured ones could factor into not having to dye them from a sustainability perspective. So some of the outcomes were that in my spare time, I enjoy drawing sheep. So kind of the aesthetics of looking at the sheep breeds, and seeing all those different visual characteristics of them next to one another, collecting 72 British pure breed yarn samples so you can squish them so you can see the difference. A Blueface Leicester woolen spun looks next to a Blueface Leicester worsted spun, whether some of them can be worsted or woolen spun, or whether the staple length affects the different abilities, how they knit up together. So they're all knitted on the same amount of stitches. However, you can see the vast array of different squares there needed just because of the process that the yarn had gone through, how much it folds, how much kind of the stitch definition is there, and also just a nice way of seeing all those different colours mapped out against one another. A room full of sketchbooks about my journey, so kind of visiting the sorting facility at British Wool, visiting different designers, mapping out Shima designs. I got some yarns woolen spun at Paul's Mill, so seeing how those different processes start to take this kind of raw fibre through to a workable yarn. Again, kind of making it visually appealing so people wanted to come and become kind of intrigued with all these different breeds. So instead of it just being some sheep out in a field, actually starting to be able to feel and touch and see those differences themselves. In the end, it was a compilation of completed data sheets, so compiling all that lot of data into something that was quite a simple, aesthetically pleasing way that is very comparable. So kind of you can put the Black Welsh Mountain next to the Cotswold. You've got all that commercial data like the micron count and the handle, but you've also got that narrative and that tacit knowledge of the microscopic qualities sitting next to the knitted sample and the raw fleece samples. If you wanted to delve a little bit deeper, created mini breed books for each of the 72 breeds that kind of talk through the breed society, the different kind of placing on the fleece, how much fleece weight you might get from certain ones. Again, kind of that historical narrative and where you might find them today, how they've evolved and developed over time. So all of that is in kind of a physical toolkit that has been exhibited at a few different places now. So this is in Manchester School of Art. Next to kind of the digital outcomes, so a British Breeds virtual yarn library that if knitwear designers wanted to use the Shima Seeker technology, they could utilise the British Breeds library to start to work in whether British wool would work within their designs without actually having to buy any of the yarn or waste any of those resources. So it's all kind of compiled and available on the woolist.co.uk website, so you can have a play around there and have a look at all the different sheep breeds and some knowledge. It's obviously there's 72 breeds, so it's getting updated continuously, and I hope to have a little bit more time in the future to add to that and really start to connect in more makers and what makers and crafters and designers are working on at the moment with those different breeds. But it allows you at the moment to kind of use the search function to look into how 72 breeds is fantastic, but there's so much variation. As a designer, what characteristics do you want out of your yarn at the end of it? So this is just an example of a designer may want a very soft handle. So you go down 72 breeds through to 7 breeds that come up as the handle is very soft. The colour and what you might want to do with it narrows it down to kind of those 4 breeds, the staple length. So whether you want it woolen spun or worsted spun, can take that down again. And then it starts to kind of, you could look into geographical location. So whether locality is important to you or whether you want to find someone within your local vicinity, and that could start to help to narrow down the perfect breed for your end garment. So as I said before, kind of it's been exhibited in quite a few different places now. And so this was Edinburgh Yarn Festival in 2019, taking kind of my work and exhibiting it, talking about it, and then allowing people to kind of have a hands-on exploration to collect more data for me, but also allow them to see all the different breeds together. Swatch samples for designers to test. as well as kind of using wool in different mediums. So taking it from kind of knitwear design and allowing other people to start playing around with it. So there's been some fantastic embroidery samples there, crochet, all these different kind of kits are available for people to try out and test out those different breeds now as well. So that kind of led me to working with Maria. I found out all this information about the different breeds, but what I was really interested in as well was how to find farmers that worked in a similar way to me, and that ethos of regenerative farming, making sure kind of it wasn't about depleting resources. It was about, one, obviously kind of really looking after the animals, but also understanding the properties that were needed for a fantastic yarn at the end of it, building up those relationships, looking into transparent field to yarn practices. So we've been working together, pushing through kind of making sure we empower farmers, and looking into all these different yarn production facilities and seeing how to build up those relationships. Again, kind of building up on that authentic sustainability and making sure that we know where our yarns come from. So we've done quite a lot of exciting blending for breeds, for yarn experimentation. As Kate said, kind of some breeds you cannot find enough of to go into commercial production. So how can we kind of blend those together? What are great bases? How do we work to create this variety and showcase this variety that isn't available at present for designers working commercial level, as well kind of through to hand knitting and domestic machine knitting, but what characteristics are needed and what we need to kind of tick off in order to make wool more accessible for a wider audience and hopefully bring that into a sustainable fashion system. So working with like-minded production partners, Bradford was and used to be kind of the epicenter for it. Now, unfortunately, there's not that many left, but we have kind of found some fantastic ones, Hall based over in Bridlington. There's a few that we have just had doors open to, and we're really excited about the conversations that we've had with them and look forward to working with them to figure out and find out all these different little bits of the journey that need plugging together to kind of fix that jigsaw together to create a really sustainable and traceable product. So these are just some of the experimental yarns that we've worked with. So incorporating Blueface Leicester with Castle McMorrick. We've got some Hebridean and Blueface Leicester, and some Cheviot as a beautiful base as well. So we've been having fun experimenting with different knitting techniques, with different production techniques to create different knitting weights. So kind of this really beautiful commercially French knitted yarn that has the feel of chunkiness, but it's as light as air. It's almost got those kind of mohair qualities to it, but that's in 100% Cheviot, which hasn't been done before. It's only been replicated with synthetics. Taking it out and about. So Maria organised the farmers' yarns and we had an amazing time. Kate was next door. Ubis Knitwear was there. There was a load of different designers and makers that had this same kind of ethos around locality and really kind of supporting the fibres and the manufacturer that were around them. Again, kind of testing the yarn in commercial production like we talked about. So working with Knit Lab North, using commercial kind of level machines, but utilising 100% British wool yarns within them. And these are just a few of the garments and there, but this is Ubis Knitwear, and they've used, I think there's Blueface Leicester blended with Castle Milk in both of those designs. So it's really exciting to see how our time and expertise and Maria's amazing, beautiful sheep fleeces have gone into these kind of finished projects. So we're really excited to see kind of where this journey takes us and really passionate about kind of connecting all those dots together. Because at the moment it still feels like there's a lot of disconnection, kind of a lot of manufacturers offshore, but bringing it back and allowing people into that conversation, into that journey, show them that yes, on the news you might see that British fleece is only worth 30 pence, but then when you're up against, well, why is this jumper, British wool jumper, now £400? Actually showing them all the processes and all the people that has to support within that journey as well is just as important. And actually a £10 jumper is not the reality. A lot of people are missing out on that. A £10 jumper is a misconception. It's, you can't talk to me about economies of scale, can never, no matter how much you make, can never justify a £10 jumper. But yes, so that is me. That is our journey so far, and we're really looking forward to kind of testing that further and assimilating kind of some of my research and Maria's knowledge into this new setup.